When Hussein stood in Medina, he was not standing as a rebel, nor as a man seeking conflict. He stood as the grandson of the messenger of God, in the very city that had witnessed revelation, prophethood, and divine light. He stood in the land where hearts had once beat with the spirit of sacrifice, where the echo of the prophet's voice still lingered in the streets and the walls. But now, something was changing. Something painful, something heavy. It was not the city that had changed, it was the silence that had settled in it. Hussein was not threatened by swords. He was surrounded by something more dangerous, a society that had begun to accept falsehood, not out of belief, but out of fear. A city that had once stood for the truth now watched quietly as injustice climbed its way to power. The voice of the Quran was still recited, but its message was no longer lived. The community had been lulled into comfort, into survival, into quiet complicity. And in that silence, tyranny thrived. That is when Hussein understood, staying in Medina would be a betrayal. Not of politics, but of truth. Remaining silent would mean endorsing what Yazid stood for. Remaining seated would mean surrendering the very legacy of his grandfather. He did not wait until they came to his door with a sword. He did not wait until his blood was spilled. His battle began the moment his heart refused to make peace with corruption. That was the first step, the departure from Medina. A step taken not on a map, but in the soul. It was a declaration that when truth is threatened, and the people fall silent, movement becomes a moral necessity. Hussein left Medina not because he desired distance, but because he could no longer breathe in a place where the truth had been chained and the people had chained themselves in fear. He did not raise his voice in rebellion. He raised it in witness. He wrote no manifesto. He carried no weapon. He simply walked away. And yet, that walk shook the foundations of power. Because nothing terrifies a tyrant more than a man who refuses to be silent. That is why Yazid could not tolerate Hussein, even in absence. He knew Hussein's silence was louder than the noise of an empire. Today, many wonder, why didn't Hussein just stay quiet? Why didn't he just blend in? Why didn't he wait for a better time? But what they forget is that every moment we delay our stand against falsehood, we strengthen its hold. Every day we remain neutral, we grant space to oppression. Hussein did not wait for the perfect conditions. He walked because conscience demanded it. And it is this walk, from Medina toward truth, that begins the path of Karbala. A journey born not of strategy, but of sincerity. A movement sparked not by politics, but by purity. This first step is the most difficult. To walk away from the comfort of safety, to disturb the silence of a city asleep, to say, no, when the world begs for silence, that is the essence of sacrifice. He left behind his home, his city, the resting place of his grandfather. He left not in haste, but with clarity. And in that departure, he spoke without words. When the Ummah forgets what it means to stand for truth, then even the family of the Prophet must become strangers among them. Even the most beloved must walk alone. And so he walked, carrying not just his family and companions, but the burden of a sleeping nation on his shoulders. Each step away from Medina was a call to awaken. A call to remember. A call to choose. And that call has reached us too. Today, we too sit in cities that recite the name of the Prophet, but watch as injustice rises. We too live in comfort, surrounded by silence. But Karbala was not just a destination, it was a consequence of ignoring Medina's silence. If we do not speak now, we will witness more Karbalas. If we do not move now, we will become part of the silence that makes oppression possible. Hussein's journey begins with one simple truth. Silence in the face of corruption is betrayal. Not only of the oppressed, but of God. Not only of the living, but of every martyr who gave their life for this religion. And so, when he left Medina, he was not fleeing danger. He was walking into destiny. And with every step, he carved a path that every believer would one day have to walk, not with feet, but with conscience. When Hussein left Mecca, he was not walking away from the Kaaba. He was walking toward its essence. This was not a journey of miles, it was a journey of meaning. And that is the part history too often forgets. Because the man who stood beside the house of God knew that the house had become surrounded by the shadows of those who did not fear God. The Kaaba had become a sanctuary in appearance, but the hearts that now circled it were hollow. Pilgrims moved, but the spirit of Ibrahim had been lost in ritual. And so, Hussein did not abandon the Kaaba, he embodied it. Every step from Mecca to Karbala was a declaration. It was not made for strategy or escape. It was made for truth. Mecca was holy, yes. But Hussein's mission could not hide behind stones, even sacred ones. The sanctity of the Kaaba is eternal, but when tyrants rule in its shadow, then the defense of sanctity must move to the front lines. And that front line was Karbala. Some warned him, "Stay in Mecca, you are safe here." But Hussein was never seeking safety. He was seeking salvation, not for himself, but for a sleeping Ummah. And salvation does not come from remaining where you are honored. It comes from going where you are needed. He knew Mecca could protect his life. But Karbala would preserve the soul of Islam. And that is why this journey is unlike any other in history. It is not the road that carries the most weight, it is the burden of truth on the shoulders of one man. When Hussein left Mecca, he was leaving behind not a city, but a symbolic shelter. A shelter that would have preserved him from the swords of Yazid. But that shelter could not preserve the message of Muhammad. So he walked. And with every step, he was saying, the truth of this deen is not protected by ritual, it is protected by sacrifice. Think about the contrast. Mecca, the place of thousands, where Hussein could have blended into the crowd. Karbala, the place of thirst, of abandonment, where every glance would fall upon him. He chose Karbala not because it promised victory, but because it demanded testimony. And testimony is heavier than victory. Victory pleases people. Testimony pleases God. Hussein became the Qibla that moved. When the world forgot which way to face, he stood and pointed again, this time not with words, but with blood. He reminded the Ummah that the Kaaba itself was built by one who was willing to place his own son on the altar of sacrifice. That the path of Ibrahim, the path of Muhammad, was never comfort, it was confrontation. Confrontation with the ego. Confrontation with injustice. Confrontation with the false peace that silence buys. This was not a journey of escape. It was a journey of arrival. He did not flee from Mecca, he ascended from it. And those who followed him not for ease, but for clarity. They knew where he was going, and yet they followed. Because when a man walks toward death, yet glows with life, hearts are compelled to walk beside him. He passed through towns, through tribes, through voices that said, "Turn back." But Hussein had already turned forward, toward Karbala, toward sacrifice, toward eternity. He knew that truth sometimes demands we leave even the holiest places, because no place, no matter how sacred, is greater than the mission to defend God's truth. This journey redefined devotion. It taught that real ibadah is not only in prostration, it is in refusal. Refusal to legitimize a tyrant. Refusal to allow the oppressor to wear the cloak of Islam. Refusal to call silence a virtue when injustice reigns. That is what Hussein did when he walked from Mecca to Karbala. He taught us that devotion without courage is incomplete. That worship without resistance is hollow. That piety without sacrifice is self-deception. So we must ask ourselves, where is our Karbala? And are we willing to walk toward it, even if it means leaving behind comfort, position, applause? Hussein did not wait for history to give him permission. He became the permission. And by doing so, he wrote a message not on scrolls, but in the sands of Karbala, a message still blowing across the deserts of every age. The journey from Mecca to Karbala is still happening. In every land where truth is threatened, in every heart where faith is tested, in every moment where silence tempts the believer, this walk begins again. The sun rises on the 3rd of Muharram, but the light does not bring peace. It reveals something far heavier than the weight of tents or the march of armies. It reveals the beginning of the final separation. A valley once silent now begins to whisper. The sand feels different. The air becomes tense. Because now, both truth and falsehood have pitched their camps, and every soul standing in between must choose: will you join the side of sacrifice, or will you remain a shadow watching from the safety of distance? This is not just a matter of geography. It is a moment in the unseen world, where souls are being measured before bodies are moved. The third step into Karbala is not about drawing swords. It is about revealing hearts. On this day, the world begins to see who is truly loyal, who is truly awake, and who still clings to silence as if it were protection. The banners are now visible. Hussein's camp stands with a message, not of conquest, but of refusal. Refusal to bow, refusal to legitimize injustice, refusal to stay silent while Islam is twisted into tyranny. And across from him stands an army with no moral cause, only orders. Thousands who cannot answer why they stand there. Soldiers who know the truth in their hearts, but fear its consequences. And then there are the watchers. The ones not in either camp. The ones who once wrote letters, pledged allegiance, and cried at the name of Hussein. But now, they sit in homes, in markets, in city squares, silent. Their pens had once promised to stand with him. Their tongues had once praised his name. But now their feet are frozen, their hearts are dull, and their excuses are endless. This is the valley of sacrifice. Not because it is soaked in blood, yet, but because it demands the hardest sacrifice of all, to take a stand before the battle has even begun. This is where true courage is tested. Before the war drums, before the clash, before martyrdom. Because anyone can cry after the tragedy. Anyone can weep at the sight of a body. But how many can rise before the first arrow flies? This is the test that the 3rd of Muharram lays before us. To choose truth not when it is victorious, but when it is isolated. To walk into a valley where the outcome seems certain, where you are outnumbered, where your end appears sealed, yet you walk because your soul has already submitted to something higher than survival. Hussein did not demand thousands. He called for sincerity. And the few who stood with him on that day, each of them had already won. Their victory was not in defeating Yazid's army, but in defeating their own fear, their own hesitation, their own attachment to this world. That is what made them timeless. That is why we remember their names, not because they were many, but because they were pure. And this is what we must understand: Karbala was not a battle of weapons, it was a battlefield of truth. Every moment was a divine sorting. The 3rd of Muharram was when the sorting began. When the eyes of heaven turned to earth, and souls were laid bare. This is why every movement Hussein made from this point forward became more than just resistance, it became divine declaration. The tragedy of Karbala is not only what the enemy did. It is what the Ummah didn't do. It is what the scholars failed to say. What the followers failed to act upon. The betrayal wasn't in the swords of Yazid, it was in the silence of the majority. And this silence was not born overnight. It was born in moments like this, on the 3rd day, when there was still time to speak, to move, to stand. Let that be a warning to us. Do not wait until the day of Ashura to cry. Do not wait until the blood has been spilled to mourn the truth. If you are not willing to rise when the cost is uncertainty, you will not find redemption when the battle is over. Because sacrifice is not only in death, it is in choosing truth when it demands everything. The valley of sacrifice is not in Karbala alone. It exists wherever the truth calls out and waits for an answer. And today, that call echoes again, not in ancient lands, but in our cities, our streets, our homes, our hearts. Will we answer before it is too late? Karbala did not end on the day of Ashura. It began. It was not merely an event sealed in the pages of history, it became a path carved through time. A path that calls out to every generation, to every heart that claims to love truth, justice, and God. The dust that rose from that desert did not settle with Hussein's final breath, it continues to rise wherever there is injustice, wherever there is silence, and wherever there is a soul that dares to say, no, in the face of oppression. Karbala is not a tragedy to be remembered once a year, it is a standard to be upheld every single day. It was not meant to gather tears alone, it was meant to awaken the conscience. When Hussein stood with his few companions against an army of thousands, he did not ask for help from the heavens to escape it. He asked to be firm in his stand. He asked for clarity. He asked that his mission live on after him. And it did, not just through stories and sermons, but through people who chose to carry his light in every age. If Karbala had ended with swords and dust, the tyrants would have won. But they didn't. Because Hussein's blood did not fall to the earth in vain. It planted seeds. Seeds that would sprout into revolutions, awakenings, and the burning refusal to submit to any falsehood, no matter how great its power. That is why Karbala is alive. That is why its flame never dies. But that flame is not passed down by history alone. It must be carried by each heart. The responsibility of Karbala was never just to be mourned. It was meant to be lived. And that is where we must look inward. Because every generation must face its own Yazid. He may not wear the same armor, he may not ride the same horse, but his nature will be the same, arrogant, unjust, corrupt, hungry for domination, and ruthless toward the righteous. And every generation will be called to answer the same question, when truth stands alone, will you walk with it? It is easy to admire Hussein from afar. Easy to shed tears over his thirst, his children, his struggle. But Karbala asks for more than sympathy. It asks for alignment. It asks for action. To weep for Hussein and yet remain silent in front of modern injustice is not loyalty, it is contradiction. To praise his courage and yet fear the consequences of standing up today is not love, it is detachment. Karbala's legacy is not just in the names of the martyrs, it is in the fire that refuses to die inside the hearts of those who have inherited that mission. It is in every believer who chooses truth over comfort. It is in every soul that walks away from corruption, even if it means walking alone. And yes, sometimes you will be alone. Sometimes you will be abandoned. Sometimes you will stand against a world that calls falsehood, wisdom, and injustice, security. But that is when the soul remembers Karbala. That is when Hussein walks beside you. If we want to honor Karbala, then we must revive its spirit. In our speech. In our politics. In our homes. In our decisions. In how we raise our children. In how we treat the oppressed. In how we speak against tyranny. In how we resist systems that try to make us forget that God is above all. This is the call of the fourth step, the legacy that does not age. The invitation that has no expiration. It calls not to warriors alone, but to every heart. To every mother raising a child in the shadow of injustice. To every youth tempted by silence and compromise. To every scholar asked to trade truth for approval. To every nation on the edge of surrender. Karbala calls to them, not as an event, but as a mirror. Will you stand as they stood? Will you walk into the valley of sacrifice, even if the world tells you to sit? And so we must ask ourselves, with honesty and trembling, if Hussein came today, would he find us beside him? Or would he find us among the watchers, the doubters, the silent, the safe? Because the truth is simple. Hussein does not need our tears. He needs our loyalty. He does not need our rituals. He needs our resolve. And Karbala is not waiting to be remembered, it is waiting to be walked again.